Hello, this is Nathan coming to you again on Canada's first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. It's Thursday, September the 30th, 2021. I've been giving this topic some thought, and I wrote about it in my weekly encouragement, but it wasn't enough space. There's too many thoughts to share. And part of it is I want to welcome some dialogue. I want to learn with you. I want to share a few thoughts, but also to invite your input. I have no claim that I fully understand or grasp what is going on or at stake, but I have a few ideas, and I have done some reading and learning, and I just want to share a few things that might give you a few insights, but also to welcome your feedback and hear your comments and insights as well. My hope is that we could learn together so that we can grow in our understanding of one another and our love for our neighbor. I do acknowledge that no matter what, this is a difficult topic. There are many sides to it. There are a lot of nuances that often get missed. But I think sometimes even we fail to give an opportunity to hear the truth on both sides. Living in Wetaskiwin, our proximity to the First Nations just south of us has affected every element of this town, of this community. And many for positive and some for negative. But it's an influence, it's a factor that we always, can't escape. So I think that's important, to acknowledge that both sides have truth that needs to be heard. Both sides meaning First Nations people and Caucasians. However, we also need to acknowledge and recognize who holds the power, because power dynamics have a real effect on things. The person in power, or the people who are in power, or the dominant culture has a stronger voice. It's not an equal voice. And historically, it has been Caucasians. It has been the settlers that have had the strongest voice, and sometimes almost the only voice. So we need to understand that power dynamics do affect everything. So we can't just say, well, they say this and we say that and it's all equal. I think part of what I hope to accomplish by this is to encourage us to become better listeners. And that starts with me. I need to work at that a little better myself. So, but remember, power has an effect on everything. And those in power have a different voice. They have a different effect when they say something than those who are not in power, who are not the majority. And that in and of itself affects the statements that are made. Secondly, I think what comes to mind for me is colonialism. We have to remember that, the whole world is affected by colonialism and is in some ways recovering from it. In other ways, there's parts of the world that are still experiencing it, definitely still the ramifications and side effects of Western colonialism. But even in certain parts of the world, people are experiencing a new colonialism based on other regions in their area. Colonialism was based out of pride and superiority, believing one culture or one skin color is better and superior than others. Even the study of eugenics back around the 1900s, which was actually like literal scientific studies about the differences between races, and that's sort of how even Hitler developed his interest in eugenics and the idea that there could be a superior race that's genetically superior and bred that way. That was a very real science, and it kind of grew out of Darwin's evolution of species. And so, that was a dominant thinking at the time. And that way, when the Brits or the Portuguese or the Spaniards or the French were colonizing, these were ideas that were still affecting things even into the 1900s. But there was definitely an idea of superiority, and we're coming to bring you civilization. Wherever they would go, that was the goal. We will bring the uncivilized, the backcountry people, the aboriginals, or whatever they would label them, the natives, wherever they were in Africa or India or Canada, Turtle Island. The idea was, we will bring culture to you. We will bring you the better culture, the more advanced civilization. Now, I was reading something recently it was kind of funny. I think it was about maybe some of the Central American cultures with the Aztecs and the Mayans. But it was talking about how supposedly Europeans brought culture and civilization, yet they were living in squalor and filth in the big cities. They didn't have sewage systems. They had problems with clean water. And when they came over to Central and South America, they discovered some very advanced civilizations with advanced building techniques, with running water, with sewer systems, with better farming for the region. So it's a little ironic to think that the Westerners brought the civilization to indigenous peoples everywhere they went. To make this even further complicated, there was a religious implication to much of these colonial expansions. Sometimes the government would sort of try to co-opt religion or bring in religion as a tool to help colonize people. And oftentimes that misrepresented the true nature of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Oftentimes it was that religious vigor and fervor that would drive people to make those sacrifices, to go to foreign lands where they'd never been, to endure hardships and disease and all sorts of things in order to try to bring the gospel to people. However, the gospel, meaning good news, wasn't always good news. When I think about colonization, I'm not as familiar with it here in Canada, actually, but I lived for a time in Guam and studied it more there, had more interaction with local people. And in Guam, there was a vigorous expansion from Spain, where Magellan, the explorer, was actually lost. His crew was on the verge of mutiny, and he came across the island of Guam. And they were able to get food and fresh water and whatnot, and actually started off with some friendly relations there. However, the Catholic Church was soon commissioned and involved, and whenever violence would break out, for whatever reasons, perhaps the local Catholic priest would want to baptize the chief's children, and the locals maybe didn't know what was going on or really just didn't want that to happen. And if something happened, or if perhaps a Spaniard was killed, then there was a disproportionate amount of violence exerted upon the local people, to where perhaps a whole village would be killed, razed to the ground, and wiped out. So the population quickly was decimated, even though when Magellan landed, there was somewhere in the realm of 50,000 Chamorro people. They were decimated down to approximately 5,000 people. And that's when the chief at the time, I think it was Chief Kapua, was able to kind of see, like, we better capitulate to these guys, otherwise, my entire people are going to be wiped out. And so they decided to embrace, or at least stop fighting and resisting, the Catholic expansion. It was a challenging time, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to see, 45,000 of your people wiped out on a small island, decimated villages, anyway. The violence begot violence, and both sides got entrenched until an entire people was almost wiped out. And Guam was not the only place that happened. But the religious side of it really made it tough. Now, not all, the religious people, not all the priests were like that or wanting that. Definitely, that's not the case. There was many times where priests would speak against the violence, but the governing body, or the governor or the king or whatever, had a policy, and they would just show a force, and they tried to be brutal. It's a difficult past, but colonization and colonialism has laid a difficult trail, a difficult gulf to try to bridge. One of the books I have read, even in seminary, was the following. And Missions, Nationalism, and the End of Empire. Quite an insightful study as to how colonization around the world has affected missions and the attempt to reach people with the good news of Jesus Christ, which I'm still about, and I believe we need to do it today as well. If you're a Christian, that's part of your calling. However, how we do that needs to evolve with changing times. The next one is different worldviews. Part of what makes it challenging for us to understand each other, First Nations and Caucasian culture, is that we have different worldviews. We are tied to different narratives, different histories that have formed us as people. My family was immigrants. Actually, all Caucasians in Canada, or on Turtle Island, as the First Nations people called North America, all Caucasians are immigrants. Doesn't matter how far back you trace your heritage, whether it's 50, 80, 100, 200, 300, 400 years, we're all immigrants or descendant of immigrants. Essentially, Caucasian immigrants came to a land that was already inhabited, and because of some of the different cultural understandings, they imposed a number of things that were not known to the local people, to the First Nations people. The heritage that we each have, which is sort of different narratives, different lines, different heritages, they have led to different understandings, even today. So I have a different cultural understanding than my First Nations brothers and sisters. A few of those things I've learned from First Nations man named Larry Wilson, who's from Winnipeg. And he doesn't speak for all First Nations people everywhere in Canada or everywhere, but it was very helpful to have some insights that he shared from his own experience as a First Nations man. And he pointed out some of the differences. The first difference is that Aboriginal people tend to focus in the present, whereas Caucasians tend to focus in the future. The second one is Aboriginal people tend to value elders, and they're those who have gone before, those who have experience, whereas Caucasian people tend to value youth. We tend to put the emphasis on the young and value the young and market the young, invest in the young, what's up and coming, because we look to the future. Also, the Aboriginal people tend to have a different value on extended family and those ties, which, also includes that their primary ties tend to be to their kin group, whereas Caucasians tend to have fewer strong ties to anybody, really. There's a lot more independence, and the people we do have ties to are by voluntary association. When you think of the history of settlers, people who had the toughness and the resolve and the entrepreneurship to come west and make a life for themselves, to establish farms and settle the land. You needed a different set of strengths. You needed to be independent. You needed to be strong. You didn't have many options to stay tied to your kin group because they were all back in the homeland. My grandparents came over in the 1920s, and my grandfather was a homesteader from Denmark who made a farm in the Spirit River country. And, it was a tough life. It was not easy. And so they needed different skills, but those values and those cultural elements have been passed on. Whereas the First Nations and the Aboriginal people who are already here, they were here for ages and ages and ages. And so, they're tied in with elders, and they're tied in with family, and they're tied in with extended family, and their kin group is well established. And those were the people, those were the tribes they were a part of. And so much more connected, even to this day, as we kind of bring that history forward. And then the last one I wanted to point out, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but the idea that success comes from building relationship. For Aboriginal people, from building good relationships is a high value, tends to be a high priority, and even a measure of success. Whereas for Caucasians, success is tied to personal achievement. What have you accomplished? What degrees do you have? What business did you start? What size of house do you live in? Almost to the point where sometimes for Aboriginal people, the greater an individual success, or the greater a certain family, if they progress and have a lot of success, it could actually lead to isolation for them in their family and their kin group. It could actually hinder their relationships. Anyway, these are a few of the differences that I've been taught. And when I connect some of these dots and the different heritage of, what it would be to be an Aboriginal person whose family history has thousands of years on this land versus Caucasian history that has maybe a couple of hundred years of settling and being frontiersmen and having to be so isolated and achieve personally in order to survive. I think it helps to understand the history, but to also say, hey, these histories have an effect on how we view the world today and how we view relationships. I also wanted to go to I guess my fourth point is that we're a product of our families. As I think about these differences between Caucasians and Aboriginals, we're a product of our families and those heritages that we have come from. So through those families, or that heritage that we each have, though they're different, it creates us, it shapes the narratives that we carry. It shapes us as individuals and what we value and what we strive for. And we are a product of our families. So when we think about residential schools and the damages that have been done to families, when we think about the interruption to parenting, to kin groups, to passing on skills of how to be healthy in relationship, of trying to wipe out language and culture and values, that's a deep, deep damage that was done. It was done out of pride, thinking that Caucasian culture was superior and better and the right way to do things. The family systems that we come from and the family heritage that we come from has a huge effect on us and on what we value and what we strive for and how we see ourselves. It shapes some of the dysfunction we carry and some of the strengths we carry. I also want to point out that whatever family system we're from, it's not our fault. Okay, it's not your fault that you were born into the family you were born into. That might have negative consequences, or it might have positive consequences. It might have given you privilege, it might have given you wealth, or it might have given you predisposition to something. It might have been a dysfunctional family. You might have grown up without a parent, a father, or a mother. You might have grown up with alcoholism in any culture. Whatever that is, it's not your fault. It's not our fault for the family we grow up into. However, what we do with it is our responsibility. What do we do with that family history? Do we acknowledge it? Do we ignore it? Do we pretend it doesn't exist? How does it shape us? Do we understand that? That is a tough and personal journey that I do believe everybody needs to go on, at least at some level, to understand their own family and where they're from and what narratives are shaping and driving them and motivating them. And we're going to be working on some of that stuff here at the church as we look through emotionally healthy discipleship. But those systems have a strong effect on who we are and how we see the world. And so we can't ignore that. Whether we're Aboriginal or Caucasian, we need to understand that these systems have an effect, and it's greater than just me choosing for myself, but that actually, even when I make choices, they affect the system I'm a part of, regardless of what family or what system that is. And sometimes the system I'm a part of will push back, and the system may not want me to make choices that might be good for me, or they might help me find freedom, regardless of what system you're a part of, what worldview you're a part of, how colonialism has shaped you. Forgiveness. I think forgiveness has to be part of what we talk about. Progress will not be made without forgiveness. As a Christian, this is a huge and important and central theme to what I believe and value. Christians believe that Jesus died for us and forgave us, and therefore we forgive others. There was nothing we did to earn the forgiveness or to deserve the forgiveness, but we did receive it. It was a giant gift that God took the initiative. God sent his son to pay the price for my wrongs and my sins. And because of that, I'm reconciled to God. I can have a right relationship between me and my Creator, me and the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I think forgiveness has to be in there. If we're going to be, like Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, if we're going to be ambassadors of reconciliation or ministers of reconciliation, forgiveness has to be part of it. We acknowledge that we've received forgiveness, and then we have to figure out ways to forgive others. For the First Nations people, I think forgiveness has to be part of the healing process for them as well. Again, I am a white person in power. I can't tell people what to do or tell someone to forgive is presumptuous. But, when I think of forgiveness, I've heard of it described like, you're holding a chain and you think it's to the other person. You think they're in bondage because you're not forgiving them, but really the chain is linked to your own ankles. And I can't. My role is to ask for forgiveness, I guess, to say, hey, would you forgive me on behalf of my ancestors and what they did? It wasn't my grandpa that had slaves or that fought with Indians or killed people, but my ancestors were part of a system that grew out of. They were a product of that system, just as we're products of the systems we have today. But I think forgiveness has to be part of the circuit breaker. Like if we don't forgive, then we'll just keep hanging on to bitterness and hurt. And really, I don't know. What do you think? Forgive me for that presumptuous. It sounds presumptuous, but I think somehow forgiveness has to be involved somewhere. I think as a white man, I need to recognize I'm in power. I need to make efforts to listen, to seek out stories and do my best to listen and to hear where people are at. And to try to understand and learn, to take the posture of a learner and a posture of humility. And that's something I want to learn and grow into. The past cannot be undone. It can't. But the future can be changed. Now, I acknowledge that I have a different worldview. That's a very Caucasian worldview, as I illustrated earlier. So that's kind of interesting as I get to my conclusions. They're birthed out of my Caucasian worldview, and I acknowledge that. But I don't think anybody would argue that the past can't be undone. It can't be undone. I think some reparations can and need to be made and have been somewhat made, maybe not completed, but have been worked on and need to be examined further. But we do in some ways have to look to the future, or to say, maybe even just to the present, to say, how do we do things in the present that will help redefine the future, or that will help set the stage for the future. What can we do in the present? How can we invest in the present, in the people right now, in the children, in the adults, in the elders, in sharing these stories? How can we invest in the now that will set the Aboriginal people up for the future, that will help affect systematic change for the future, that will help affect Caucasians and Aboriginal people to hear each other and grow together as neighbors in a healthy way for the future? How do we need to examine our systems? What changes need to be made? In some ways, how can we work together to see God's will done for the future? Because God's will does include everybody. There is love for all. God has a heart for the Aboriginal people, for the First Nations people. God continues to grieve the damage that has been done to people who have been made in God's image. So what are some of those things we might do? That's a question I really want to put out to you. What are some of those things we might do to help provide family stability, or change some of these family systems to help promote mental health in all aspects of our society? I'm sure this video's run on long enough, and if you've stayed with me this long, thank you. I really would love to hear from you and to further this conversation, because in some ways I don't know how, or this is a way that I do know how. I know how to make a video. I want to put it out there, and I want to share it so that I can learn and grow. And I do want to nurture a posture of humility. So I'd love to hear from you. Take care, and I pray that you would find ways to celebrate on this first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada. God bless.